The Constitution Act of Canada, 1867, Article 91. It shall be lawful for the Queen, by and with the advice and consent of the Senate and House of Commons, to make laws for the peace, order, and good government of Canada. Article 91, subsection 3. It shall be lawful for the Queen to make laws for the raising of the money by any mode or system of taxation. In 1867, they brought into force of law the Constitution Act of Canada. And when you look into Article 91, it states that the Queen, with the advice of the Senate and the House of Commons, for the good governance of Canada, could erect a law concerning the raising of money in the form of a taxation system. Now this is 1867. Now this taxation system that was erected was applicable upon the Canadian citizen. CRA, well at the time it wasn't CRA, but you understand, it was applicable upon the Canadian citizen. The International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. Entry into force the 23rd of March 1976. So it was adopted and it was given force of law 23rd of March 1976. In 1976, when the International Covenant came into existence, we see rights and freedoms such as no one can be held in servitude. And you can take recognition as a person, but you don't have the obligation. And you can be part of or take part of the government, but again, you have no obligation. Now, these are just three simple expressions of that law. However, you see they run against the Canadian citizen and the kingdom that had been set up here in Canada. Because now there are rights and freedoms that were not in operation in Canada prior to the existence of this. And if they weren't really recognized. The Constitution Act of Canada, 1982. Now we come to 1982, and there's another Constitution Act that's been erected or brought forth here in Canada, Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And this Charter of Rights and Freedoms is an expression. It's an expression of the obligations that Canada had, that were upon Canada, to implement the fundamental human rights and freedoms that were in the covenants in 1976. So you're looking at 6 years later, Canada erects a constitution to have agreement with this covenant. 6 years it took. The International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, Article 5. It says, nothing in the present covenant may be interpreted as implying for any state, group, or person any right to engage in any activity or perform any act aimed at the destruction of any of the rights and freedoms recognized herein, or at their limitation to a greater extent than is provided for in the present covenant. In the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, there are a whole bunch of human rights and fundamental freedoms that are enumerated in that covenant. And they are there for us to use. They are there for us to stand under. Now, in that International Covenant, it states this fact. It says that the state party, that meaning Canada, for my example, it could mean America, it could mean England, it could mean, it depends where you are, but the state party can limit these rights and freedoms. So they can limit them. Whatever rights, human rights and freedoms are found within the covenant, the state party can limit them. But only to the extent that the covenant indicates. So let's go with an example here. By now, hopefully you've watched a few of my videos and you've heard of the fundamental right that everyone has, and that is you can take recognition as a person before the law. You have no obligation, but you can take that recognition. So, if you, as a human being, as a man or woman, take recognition as a person before the law, then these human rights and fundamental freedoms can be limited. They can be limited. But you're not forced. But if you do, then they can be limited, and they will be limited. The state party, Canada, can limit your rights and freedoms. They can limit them, but only as much as the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights allows it to do. Now, when it comes to taxes, in the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, first of all, there's no obligation on a human to pay taxes. And guess what? There's no obligation on a person or a Canadian citizen, the people of the state, to pay taxes. That's a right and freedom that was granted to every citizen of a state party. Now, Canada does not like that one, that freedom, does not want you to know about that one, and does not want to actually implement that one. The International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, Article 1, subsection 2. All peoples may, for their own ends, freely dispose of their natural wealth and resources, without prejudice to any obligations arising out of international economic cooperation, based upon the principle of mutual benefit and international law. In no case may a people be deprived of its own means of subsistence. In the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, Article 1, it states that all peoples, now notice that, all peoples, so here it's referring to, in my case, in my country, the Canadian citizen, people of the state, the person. So all peoples may freely dispose of their natural wealth without obligations, okay? Without any obligations that are based upon the principle of mutual benefit or international law or international obligations. Now when you look at a democratic society, right? Democratic society, it is based upon the principle of mutual benefit. When they say civil right or public domain, it's based upon the principle of mutual benefit. When they send taxation to you, they state that we want you to pay this taxation because it is for the mutual benefit of Canada. With this money that we're taking from you, and not telling you have a choice, but taking from you, we are going to use it for the mutual, they tell you, we are going to use it for the mutual benefit of this country. We are going to use it for the social systems. We are going to use it to make it a great place here in Canada. Now if you believe that, I have another line I could sell you. Just go look at my other videos and you'll see what they actually do with the money here in Canada. But nevertheless, that's what they say. We're taxing you based upon the principle of mutual benefit. Now here, in the international law, remember, Canada can only limit your rights and freedoms, so Canada can only tax you if they had permission, if you could find it in the international covenants. If you look in both international covenants, you will not find the word tax or taxation. And when it comes to dealing with it, it says that all peoples can freely dispose of their natural wealth without obligations. So when they send you that form and says, I request that you pay your taxation to me based upon the principle of mutual benefit, you can return and say, well, hang on a second. I don't have any obligation to that system. It's my fundamental right and freedom, even as a people, not to have to depart with my natural wealth. So you have that right and freedom not to have to depart with your natural wealth. Yet Canada wants to limit that right and freedom and say, I'm sorry, you have an obligation, and I'm going to force you. I'm going to force you here into the taxation. But you can turn around and say, the only way you're allowed to limit my rights and freedoms is if the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights grants you the authority to do so, or gives you the right to do so. And here I'm showing you in the article of law, Mr. Government, that you don't have the right to force me to pay into mutual benefit. You don't have the right to force me, to obligate me to give my natural wealth into this system. The International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, Article 47. Nothing in the present covenant shall be interpreted as impairing the inherent right of all peoples to enjoy and utilize fully and freely their natural wealth and resources. It's interesting when you look in the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, Article 47. Listen to what it states. Nothing in the present covenant shall be interpreted as impairing the inherent right of all peoples to enjoy and utilize fully and freely their natural wealth and resources. Twice this is stated in the covenant. No other right or freedom that was enumerated in the covenant was stated twice. This was. And we look at it more closely. It says that nothing in the present covenant. So there's no rules, there's no regulations that are expressed in the covenant itself that can be interpreted to impair or take away the inherent right of people to enjoy and utilize fully and freely their natural wealth and resources. So again, try taxation. Tax. Well, I want to take away from you, from your natural wealth, from your resources. You work for it, you get a paycheck, I want to tax you upon that. Well, according to the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, they do not have the right to do this to you. You can exercise your fundamental right and freedom to say that my wealth, even as a people, as a person, as a Canadian citizen, I'm not under the obligation to give to you so it can be used for mutual benefit. Now here in Canada, what they do is they make you feel bad. If you watch TV commercials, if you listen to politicians speak, and if you actually communicate with the government offices, what they do is they say, well, this taxation here that we take from you, it's used for the social systems of Canada. So be a good servant and do your duty. They waste the money here in Canada, but that's not even the issue. The issue is that as a human being or as a legal person, artificial person, Canadian citizen, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights gives you the right to stand under an article of law that says you can't tax me. You can't take away my wealth. In 1867, they drew up that Constitution Act. We looked into Article 91, and in Article 91 it stated that it would be lawful for the Queen to make laws for the good governance of Canada. And it's stated more specifically, it would be lawful for her to erect or to start a taxation system through legislation. And that's what they did. Now you need to understand a little bit about taxes. Taxes are drawn upon the Canadian citizen. It's a duty or an obligation that they try to say that the people of Canada, the person, the Canadian citizen, must pay. You have no choice. So in 1867, that's what they declared. They said it's going to be lawful for the Queen to do this, and they went ahead and did this. Now, we come to 1976. In 1976, that International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights was signed. It was brought into force, and it was applicable upon the state party, upon Canada. Now, within that covenant, you find an expression of a whole bunch of rights and freedoms that are in there for the human being. And those rights and freedoms, they conflicted. They conflicted against the Constitution Act of Canada. For example, most of my viewers know that when you say, I am a Canadian citizen, what you are actually stating is that you are a person who has pledged an oath of allegiance to serve Her Majesty, Queen Elizabeth II, the Queen of Canada, and to obey her laws. That's what it means. That's a designation of a Canadian citizen. Now, when you come into the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, you see this law was erected in 1976, way well after 1867, but we find a new right being expressed. This one, for example, that no one can be held in servitude. No one. So there's a problem here, because in 1867, Her Majesty erected a law, put forth a law, and said, I'm going to tax my subjects. However, now we have the right as human beings, and it's been recognized, and it's been granted, and we can claim upon it that we do not have to be held in servitude. If we do not have to be held in servitude, then we are not considered subjects or servants of Her Majesty. Apart from that, another article of law came into existence, and it states that everyone has the right to take recognition as a person before the law. So you have a right, if you want, to take recognition as a person before the law, not an obligation. You can remain as a human being. Now when you look into the international, well, let's continue with Canada. Canada didn't ratify their Constitution Act. They were not, if you will, fulfilling their obligations in their Constitution Act once the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights was given force of law, because we only had the Constitution Act of 1867. So in 1982, Canada made something that was called, or brought into force of law, something that was called the Canadian Constitution Act, the Charter of Rights and Freedoms of 1982. And within that Charter of Rights and Freedoms is the expression of the international obligations that Canada had, according to the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. You look, it was 1976, 1982. We're talking about 6 years later in order for Canada to fulfill its obligation to erect a constitution that complies with the international obligations of law. The International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, Article 2, subsection 2. Were not already provided for by existing legislative or other measures, each state party to the present covenant undertakes to take the necessary steps in accordance with its constitutional process and with the provisions of the present covenant to adopt such laws or other measures as may be necessary to give effect to the rights recognized in the present covenant.